Hello and welcome once again to another episode of Science Fiction Power Scaling. Now today we're not actually going to be doing any direct power scaling, but we're actually going to talk about an important factor when doing science fiction power scaling and just general space power scaling in general. That's a double general there. And that is, of course, speed. Speed is very important in power scaling. Because if you have a spaceship that moves faster than another spaceship, then it could potentially do a hit and run on that spaceship and attack more efficiently. Or if weapons move faster, that's also very important. In addition to that, it is an important factor when having fighter craft, to have them have a fast speed relative to larger vessels. Otherwise, they become a bit redundant or perhaps even disadvantageous. Now, that being said, it is important to think about one big concept here, and that is the speed of light. And generally speaking, in a lot of science fictions, where you go interstellar, you've got a distinction between propulsion, that is speed of light and above, and propulsion that is below the speed of light. Now, of course, in all the science fiction universes I've seen, they operate on the assumption of a constant speed of light. So for this instance, we're going to work on this assumption. Okay. So, generally speaking, scientifically, a lot of people think that it would be theoretically impossible to move it above the speed of light in regular space, or through a general traveling through space in a normal manner. Now, of course, there are different ways that science fiction authors use to get around that, or sometimes they don't need to get around that at all. And I'll give you an example soon enough. So you look at, for example, Star Trek. Star Trek, you've got hyperspace, and that is the faster than light transportation, and then you can jump out of hyperspace and you just have the regular propulsion systems. There might be other stuff in the expanded universe that I don't know about, but that's what I know about, and that is what the movies tell us, and that's why I know about this. So the fighters are relatively fast, I'd say, but now let's contrast that with the original Battlestar Galactica, where you have no special method of faster than light transportation, as far as I know, unless I missed something. But for the most part, they're just accelerating, and they can simply accelerate past the speed of light, and it's no problem. Now, that being said, judging from some dialogue, it is implied that the Colonial Vipers can go at around the speed of light in combat, which of course means that the fights in Battlestar Galactica are happening very fast in relation to other fighter combat, for example, in Star Wars, Star Trek, and Stargate, and Babylon 5, just to round it all out. They are moving extremely fast, theoretically, because their top speed is at around the speed of light, which of course gives them a huge advantage over anyone that doesn't have that speed, to be able to fight at a higher speed like that. And of course, this can also be seen in martial arts. If you're a lot faster than your opponent, then you can hit your opponent and dodge much more easily than your opponent can hit you or dodge you. So that's a very important factor. Now, then you have instances where the faster than light movement actually affects regular space. For example, in Star Trek, where they're moving faster than light with warp, which is essentially warped space, so it's not going into a separate space, it's the same space except it's being warped. So they can still interact with the surrounding universe, which gives them the ability to warp strafe, which is to say they can move really fast in warp speed and fire torpedoes at warp speed at faster than light speeds, which of course gives them an advantage when engaging with someone who cannot do that. And of course, the torpedoes can be fired at warp speed and they can maintain warp speed. This is shown in canon material multiple times, in fact. Now, in addition to that, you have Babylon 5, where they have a sort of hyperspace, but the hyperspace in Babylon 5 is just like regular space, except it's on I guess a different relative scale to regular space. So distances are technically shorter, but or at least they're warped, depending on how you interpret it. But they can still fight just like they could in regular space. But they can, of course, only engage each other in hyperspace. And then you also have special maneuvers where you can destroy a hyperspace portal as it opens. You can shoot stuff at it and it'll destabilize it and can destroy a spaceship. So that's important to note. Now, why am I talking about all this? Well, because all of this is important in power scaling. For example, in Star Wars, you're not going to be able to counter effectively against being able to move fast as the speed of light or being able to warp strafe. But, of course, Star Wars has its own advantages in the magnitude of firepower and also in the toughness of the spaceships. Of course, there is a lot of heated debate about this. In addition to that, on a more strategic rather than tactical side of things, it's important to power scale this as well, depending on what exactly you're trying to power scale, of course. But strategically speaking, you have Star Wars has an advantage over Star Trek, because in Star Wars you can move across the galaxy in a relatively short amount of time as opposed to in Star Trek, at least for most of the series in Star Trek. Now, of course, after Voyager, it presumably did reverse engineer transwarp from the Borg, and they'd be able to do that. Or they'd reverse engineer the, what are they called, the subspace conduits. I think, no, slipstream. That's what it's called, the slipstream. They'd be able to reverse engineer, which, of course, is something that Star Trek Online does, but that's non-canon. So a lot of people are going to get upset because they called it non-canon. But anyway, for the purposes of general power scaling, that doesn't apply. Even though eventually they do get the logistical situation evened out where they can travel across the galaxy relatively fast. That doesn't apply in this situation. But, so Star Trek, generally speaking, FTL in Star Trek is relatively slow compared to Star Wars. Surprisingly, the original Battlestar Galactica, although theoretically it's actually very inconsistent if the fighters move at light speed and then the Battlestar crosses the galaxy, it sort of doesn't make sense, which of course is going to require a lot of theories to clear up, and Stargate also moves relatively fast across the galaxy, and Babylon 5 moves relatively fast across the galaxy, although Babylon 5, I'd say, is probably slower than Star Trek. Star Wars. Babylon 5 is faster than Star Trek, slower than Star Wars in their FTL. And again, Stargate, it's important to note that their FTL capabilities, the FTL capabilities available in Stargate, vary depending on who you're talking about and also depending on where you are in the story. For example, at the end of Season 1 and the beginning of Season 2, the two-parter, Teal'c believes that it's going to take, I think, several days for the Hattaks that Apophis sent to reach Earth. But he's wrong, because the FTL is a lot faster than he expected. And that is because of some technology improvements. So, in addition to that, towards the end of the series, the Tauri have the ability to move intergalactically with their spaceships. Now, of course, it still does take a while to go between galaxies, but it is relatively fast compared to, let's say, the Wraith, who, for the most part, can't do that. Now, of course, they can upgrade their hives to get a super hive that can do that, but generally speaking, they aren't as fast. And we see that in the series as well, as it takes them quite a while to get toward Atlantis in the climax of the first season, I believe, where the Wraith really take their time going to Atlantis. Now, of course, they're actually not going fast. They're not hurrying to Atlantis, so we can't really say that it's their maximum speed that they're really slow, because they're actually stopping by a lot of planets to cull the population, to eat the people there. But relatively speaking, they're not as fast as Vitari or the late SG-1 Goa'uld, who can cross the galaxy relatively quickly, late SG-1, but aren't really intergalactic, late SG-1, because the intergalactic capability is, during the SG-1 era, limited to Asgard technology. So, of course, that's an important thing to note. And also, regarding not being able to move fast when others are able to move fast, the Borg in Star Trek can move relatively fast compared to practically every other power, every other state, every other civilization that they encounter, except for that one species that made the quantum slipstream, but they were wiped out by the Borg. But the Borg have the transwarp, so they can travel reasonably fast within their own galaxy. Now, of course, an important thing to note about the limitations of the Borg transwarp is that it works by generating transwarp conduits, which actually remain in place after they're generated, and the conduits are, let me think, they, however, can be opened again, but you still need to be able to use your transwarp coils in order to do that. You can't just randomly have a regular spaceship fly into a transwarp conduit, unless it's an open conduit that, for example, the ones that we see at the end of Voyager. But additionally, the Vadoir and whoever took over their system, they had their own system, and someone took them over. I forget who it was. They could move relatively fast compared to other cultures, and there are wormholes in Star Trek. Now, another thing to note is in Star Wars, generally they have to calculate their hyperspace jumps, so it isn't something that you can just do right out of the bat. They can't just enter into the Milky Way galaxy and say, oh, this is the coordinates for Earth, let's go right there. No, they actually need time to calculate that, because presumably there are things that change what is a fast route and what is a slow route in hyperspace in Star Wars. It could be gravity. I'm not actually familiar with the expanded universe explanations behind these things, but calculating hyperspace jumps is a thing in Star Wars. And of course, in Babylon 5, it's very important to always stay on the hyperspace beacons, because in order to find your way anywhere in hyperspace, you need to follow a set of beacons, because hyperspace is a sort of, I guess it is warped a bit, and it has drift to it, so if a spaceship ceases propulsion, it will eventually drift in the Babylon 5's hyperspace. So it's important to note that they require beacons. Now, of course, they can actually set up new beacons, but in order to do that, they need to chart the course, and presumably it is done when they build a jump gate near a planet, and then they connect it up to the other beacons in the system. That's probably what they do. We never saw it happening in canon, but that is probably how I think it works. Now, of course, finding the planets is its own challenge, finding the planets in order to do that. So anyway, again, as I was trying to say, it's very important in power scaling to consider that there are differences in how they achieve propulsion, and also that these differences can cause huge advantages or disadvantages strategically, specifically talking about FTL, or tactically when talking about sublight, including in some cases FTL when you're talking about original series Battlestar Galactica, and also Star Trek with warp strafing. Now, of course, impulse speed in Star Trek, it hasn't really been nailed down, but in canon, it has been seen to be up to 1/3 the speed of light when in the motion picture, and I think 1/4 the speed of light in one of the Voyager technical manuals. So, of course, I don't think that throughout the series impulse speed is improving significantly, but I think it's just worth noting that there is some scaling there, that there is something to be scaled. So anyway, thank you all for listening. Hopefully I have been very thought-provoking. If you would like to collaborate with me, if you have something to add, if you'd like to take over my show, oh no, but if you think that you've got something to say, I really would appreciate it if you commented below, or you contacted me via email so that we can collaborate, or if you even just have an angry essay to write saying, this is why you're wrong, this is what's wrong with what you're saying. You can even do it on previous videos. It's fine. I'll try to address it. I'd love to have some interaction. That's what I'd really love. So anyway, thank you all for listening, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltos Over and Out.